Hello and welcome to this episode of the Hello Firstname podcast, Season 2. My name is Rasmus Houlind, author of the book Hello Firstname, and the theme of this season is how to solve the content crisis for personalization. Let's dive in. Hello everybody and welcome to this special episode of the Hello Firstname podcast. So it just happens to be that this episode is going to be launched while there is winter vacation in Denmark. So hence I won't be publishing an episode with a guest today. However, I thought it was time that we perhaps looked at where are we in the process. So the whole idea of this season of the Hello Firstname podcast was to get closer to what you could call the personalization layer and how content and data feed into each other and how that will ultimately solve the content crisis for personalization. So I thought it was maybe due time with an update of where are we right now, and also a bit about the background for this season to those of you who haven't listened in on the podcast before. So let me take you just a bit back here. So how the data layer and the content layer fit with personalization, or what I call the CX layers, which I'll get into. So the idea here behind the podcast is that personalization just doesn't happen on its own. There's like a thing that goes before this. So the idea and the concept of the CX layers is that we have the content layer and the data layer. I'll go into details on that in a second. And those ultimately merge into the personalization layer, and wonderful things happens and everybody gets a personalized customer experience. Let's take it a bit back, because looking back also to the content that I've made earlier, and namely publishing a Hello Firstname. The main model and the core of that book was the bow tie personalization. And the claim was that if you really boil down personalization, what is really left there? And what we figured out, my co-authors and I wrote this together with Frans Riemersma and Mathias Andersson and Ariel Horsberg from the Netherlands and Sweden and Norway respectively. We found out that really what personalization is about is how you match your insights together with your content, with your insights being either like fairly static groups of customers, as in segments, could be value-based segments, could be demographic segments, or the moments of truth, the points in time where your customer could or should be making up their minds, or are making up their minds about a decision that involves your company, that involves your brand. Then on the content side, if you split that part of the bow tie into, you could argue that you have the content feeds, which would be sort of similar to what you could also refer to as recommendations. So that would be sets of content that the marketer doesn't create, but namely sort of ranks or selects or divides, or so a lot of content that you feed from somewhere else, and then you, depending on the characteristics and the properties, you choose to show certain feeds or sub feeds of that within a piece of communication to a customer. But as my friend Tom Burrell once told me, no one really got excited emotionally about a content feed or a set of recommendations. And that's where the messages come in. So the type of content, the pieces of content that are there to make customers change their mind, do something quicker or faster, or just experience something or know something, or do something basically. So in combination, these four elements can make up sort of the bow tie of personalization. And the idea then is that you have sort of different ways of looking at personalization depending on how you what sort of challenges that you are trying to solve. So if you are in a campaign scenario, for instance, you would tend to focus on the top part of the bow tie of personalization here. So looking at, okay, so how do we match our messages with the segments that we are talking to? So with campaigns, we're working outbound. It's something that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the customer lifecycle. At this point, we're communicating to a broad range of people, because it is, I don't know, Easter, it is like a big holiday or blockbuster occasion personalization. So we're communicating outbound, and hence we'd like to break through the clutter by making sure that our message is adapted to each segment that the end customer belongs to. So that's essentially sort of the gist of personalization within campaigns. Obviously, you can do parameterizations and all kinds of stuff as well to make it even more relevant. Marketing automation, on the other hand, I mean, we're still working outbound, so we're still communicating to people that maybe would rather like to do something else, like go and get more ice from the fridge or whatever. So we're trying to accommodate our message to where in the customer lifecycle is this particular individual right now. So this will be going out. The send out time would be like individual, maybe even down to triggered communications, but could also be scheduled periodic communications that will go out to certain customers depending on where they are in the customer lifecycle, what's going on in their lives right now, who left a browsing session where they've been browsing crazy for a bikini, even though it's February, something is happening there, who has a subscription that's about to expire, and so on. So these moments of truth, tapping into those can mean a great deal, and essentially tapping into a lot of those or more of those is what marketing automation is about. Working with personalization on site or in the app or on inbound platforms, as you can say. It's more a matter of making sure that you put the right product feeds or content feeds or article feeds in front of the right people with the right shelves with the right headings. So imagine that you're shopping at a grocery store where you never were before, but all the shelves were like neatly sorted and named in accordance to your grocery list. So that would sort of be the apex of taking personalization on a website to the next level. So that's kind of the idea with the bow tie of personalization. I hope that gives a bit of sort of insight to those of you who aren't familiar with it. I should say, please remember that you can download the assets here for this particular episode and for the whole series in general. Or you can even watch this on YouTube, so you actually get the pictures and the presentation that goes along with this. All right, but what comes before the bow tie of personalization? That was essentially part of the question that is part of the question that I'm trying to answer here in this season of the Hello Firstname podcast. And I'll take you back a few years when I think Frans Riemersma and Scott Brinker had their MarTech trend report. I think it was for 2023. They opened the idea of having this content layer, which would be sort of equally important as is the data layer. But until now, no one has really sort of taken the trouble of sort of deconstructing the content layer and finding out how does that work in conjunction with the personalization layer. How do the content layer and the data layer ultimately meet in the personalization layer? Until now, where me and Frans, my co-author, actually took this into our hands and started really looking into this, and I've been refining that over the podcast series, and then so has Frans been doing that. So the idea of this main idea is that, first of all, the notion of the data layer is sort of widely accepted in the MarTech space. So you have imagine you have like a flow or a pipeline of data where you are, first of all, you're collecting data like either through like ETL, or you're ingesting data, or you're capturing it from the website and whatnot, and you're then processing that into master data, which is more stitched, it is cleaned, it is enriched, and you have this data that you sort of trust, and you know that this can be trusted in terms of formatting and quality and whatnot. And then the next phase is really about data modeling. So you're applying predictive analytics, you're applying machine learning, you may be doing some filtering and some viewing and some stuff on this that will actually turn data into insights. And so the last part of this, or the data pipeline of the data layer, the last phase of this would be data activation. So activating the data, or activating the insights, as I prefer calling it, using reverse ETL. And really making those insights available, like either in a single customer view or like the golden customer record. And so these topics relate to this data layer as well. Then imagine that we sort of extract from the data layer what is actually content. So we realize that content is obviously saved in a database, but does that mean that we should automatically call it data because it can be stored in a database? I guess everything turns into data then. So the distinction here is that, what if we think about all the data that an end customer would or will eventually be looking at? So data, when looked upon, has the the effect or has the intended effect of changing someone's mind or making someone do something faster. So that suddenly means that we're appealing to emotions and not only logic. So it's like another way of looking at it. I've seen and heard from a lot of people that I've presented this to, that this actually gives them, there's a lot of sense making to this. Suddenly they realize, okay, that was why I had trouble, finding out the content, and that had to be treated differently because it was in fact content. So play with the thought of sort of extracting all the data that someone will look at, and that's what I call content. Extracting the content from the data layer and turning that into a content layer of its own with similar phases. So you'll be having like content collection as you have data collection. You'll be having master content in much the same way as you have master data. You'll be doing content modeling, like doing localized tagged content. You'll be working with templates in much the same way as you're working with data modeling. And ultimately, you'll be activating the content. You'll be publishing the content for people to see on your website and on your apps. It's not that difficult to sort of picture this in your heads. And I hope even that distinction makes sense for you. Yes, this is a separate process. And then you ask yourself, okay, so what does this has to do with the bow tie of personalization? Well, of course, I mean, if there is no content, there isn't any marketing. And coming back to the bow tie of personalization, I think you'll see here that it fits beautifully between sort of content activation and data activation. Really, that's where you match the insights with the content. So that's how this relates to sort of the old framework of the bow tie of personalization. Ultimately, the content layer and the data layer sort of meet in what we've chosen to call the personalization layer. I mean, albeit in a fairly simplified form. So here the first phase of that would be called experience optimization. So often happens on the websites and on the inbound platforms, where you'll be experimenting with sort of when this particular content hits the average user, which kind of data is created, which kind of results are we getting, which kind of conversion rates are we getting, and how can we optimize the experience here for the average customer at first, like how can we optimize different nudges, how can we optimize different information architecture, different navigation and such, to find out how do we actually convert better at a general level. So how do our PDPs look, how do our PCPs look, and how do our checkout pages look, and so on, and how do we optimize those for conversion. That's sort of where personalization starts for a lot of people. But really being able to actually scale that decisioning, so with experience decisioning, which is the name of the next phase, that's where you actually start you start personalizing for real. So you'll be finding out sort of which insights and which content fits together. This is really where you tie the knot in the bow tie of personalization. Finding out, okay, so which messages fit to a particular scenario, to a particular individual, to a particular segment, to a particular moment of truth, and which content recommendations, which content feeds fit in this experience decisioning as well. Really trying to figure out what is the most clever thing to treat the most clever experience to treat a specific end customer with. And then ultimately, that would be then, either activated on your website. We see that happening as sort of the last part of a personalization quite often, whereas the outbound experience orchestration as the last phase of the personalization layer is called, is where personalization is most often applied to first. So all the outbound communication, either and especially on your own media, but also really leveraging those insights into paid media, making sure that you have basically an omni-channel set of communication that you could ultimately meet the customer with, no matter which channel that you meet them on. So, and the thing is here that with these layers here, so the data layer here in the bottom of the drawing here, as you can see if you're watching this or if you're downloading the files, the data layer and the process within sort of the data pipeline of the data layer, I mean, it's largely integrated and it's by and large an automated process within many companies. And indeed, sort of CDPs have helped this happen to a great extent. I think in general, data management and working with data insights has become far easier over the last decade than it has like ever before. But when you then look at the parallel process in the content layer, like with content collection, master content, content modeling, and content activation, you'll see that as of present, this is a largely fragmented and manual process where we're talking about big files, we're talking about retransfers, we're talking about big assets, and going from sort of one phase here into the next isn't necessarily a bliss. So that's why we are representing that sort of with the X's here. What we believe, however, is that we'll be working towards a future where we are integrating the content layer. First of all, sort of between the different phases within the content layer, and ultimately into the personalization layer as well. So the data layer and the content layer then ultimately meet up in the personalization layer. So we have sort of a seamless flow of, or seamless use of the content and the assets and whatnot that you have sort of going a bit more sort of upstream in your content layer. You'll be able to utilize those content streams into your experience optimization, into your experience decisioning, into your experience orchestration with a totally seamless workflow and with really, really nice ways of working, so you don't feel all the friction that you're feeling now as a marketer. And what we believe here is actually that in much the same way as machine learning and predictive analytics, in much the same way as that is playing a part in actually making the data layer flow, in making the data pipeline flow into insights, we believe that generative AI will play much the same role when it comes to the content layer. So basically integrating sort of each step in the content layer through, for instance, queries or bridging documents, or doing snapshot of saying, okay, so this is our core value proposition. Let's take a snapshot of that and freeze that. We may revise it later, but let's sort of take a snapshot of where we are now and make that available for further prompting sort of through generative AI in the next phase of the content layer, and so on. Ultimately, ending up with a personalization layer that sort of pulls and leverages all the content that you've been creating in defined processes throughout the content layer, spending more time on quality assurance, at least at first, and for some years to come, to make sure that nothing is meeting the end customer that looked like a traffic accident, or where people have our X amount of fingers, or the text is off brand, or it's not comparing to our positioning or our tone of voice, and so on. But ultimately, the end goal here will be that we have like a fully seamlessly integrated personalization layer that is leveraging both the data layer and the insights coming from that, as well as the content layer and all the wonderful assets and the repurposing of content into what the end customer will ultimately see. So that was some ideas of how we believe that this will move forward. And I thought it was due time to sort of see where are we now with this. What we found in the sort of presentations that we've done until now is also that this can actually almost be seen as sort of a tech vendor view on sort of which sort of capabilities are we supporting with our technology. So obviously within the data layer, you'll be seeing a lot of CDPs working. You'll also be seeing like a tool like dynamic yield or made with intent or whatever, that a lot of modelings being made within some tools, and some have their sort of clear focus points on this. I think dynamic yield will probably sit somewhere around here, like with the content activation, experience decisioning, experience optimization, also data modeling and collection to some extent. A tool like Telium will be very much about making the data layer flow, not necessarily having the master data as such. That will be like in a data lake. So you can see that kind of makes sense there. Looking at vendors and the suppliers like, for instance, Optimizely may have started out as like in the content modeling and content activation sphere with their the old Episerver CMS, adopting Optimizely as a sort of experimentation product. That's when they merged. And ultimately now they're sort of integrating backwards, also making sure that they have like the right marketing resource management modules, and this the notion of the optimizely one is a way of looking at this. And obviously Agilic, where I'm spending most of my working time, is very much about sort of making sure that you have the experience decisioning in place and you're using that within our platform, especially the messaging part, with combining business rules and insights that you're getting from the data layers and really orchestrating that outbound to get the most bang for the buck, or making that personalized content available on your inbound platforms as well. So in that sense, the CX layers here also serve as a map to sort of gauge and evaluate different technologies and see, okay, so where are we falling behind, and where are we excelling, and which parts of these layers do we need to integrate further in the past. In the future, obviously. So that was the idea. Just bear with me that this episode will be sort of a snapshot of where we are now. I hope that you will find this way of looking at things useful. The process is now sort of integrating that into the updated version of Hello Firstname that I hope that we'll all be looking forward to, and that a lot of people can benefit from when they're making decisions on how to plan their personalization efforts, how they're planning their roadmaps, how they're planning their MarTech acquisition processes and whatnot. So thank you for listening to this. And remember, as always, that you can download the illustrations, you can download the audiobook, like full audiobooks actually available. And of course, I hope that you'll be looking forward to subscribing to this particular podcast. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to yet another episode of the Hello Firstname podcast. Remember that all models discussed in this podcast can be downloaded and are free to use. The original book, Hello Firstname, can likewise be downloaded as either the full audiobook or as a written abstract. All links are in the show notes. The podcast is brought to you by our sponsor, the omnichannel marketing automation platform, Agilic. Visit www.agilic.com for more information.